So following after Terry O'Fallon, hard act to follow. When I was on the way here this morning, a wonderful friend of mine reminded me that everyone remembers the end of the conference, and this is the last speech, so no pressure. So what Terry O'Fallon took 6 months to do to develop her model, I think she must be much quicker than me because I've been working on this thing for the last 6 years and it's nowhere near complete. I'm hoping that what I share today will be useful in some way to those of us here in the room and to perhaps a greater audience. I don't know though. Like Terry said, I've made it all up. And I found it useful, but perhaps nobody else will. So with that, I'm hoping and praying that you will. So I'd like to start with just the era that we live in. Many of you have heard of the term meta-crisis. And so I'd love to hear from the room, when you hear meta-crisis, what comes up for you? What words come into your mind?
Opportunity.
Opportunity. What else? Challenges. Too big. Universe. Transformation. Complexity. Wicked problems. Everything all at once.
Everywhere all at once. A bad word.
A bad word. Vulnerability. Beautiful. Thank you. So the subtitle of this is a model, theory, and practice to birth our world through the meta-crisis. So crisis, inherent in it, has an idea of something that might be challenging or difficult, something we have to get through. And my intent here today is to orient our collective attention towards healthy, ethical, and functional wholeness. So while we can look at the meta-crisis and see challenges, too far. We can see challenges, global warming, pandemics, cultural trauma, war, poverty, economic collapse, addiction, and the list goes on and on and on, and it seems like there's more and more of these things that we can collect and pick up. What happens when we orient our attention to these topics? What's the visceral experience that comes up for us? And what happens when we think of it as an opportunity, as a chance for humanity to rise to the challenge, to meet the needs of the rising complexity of our society? What is it that can birth through us? How can we see this as a chance for us to evolve to an entirely new form of consciousness? So I'd like to start today with a meditation to check in on what are the perspectives that we're coming from when we orient towards this grand meta problem. So if we can take a moment to just find our center. I'd imagine almost everyone in this room is a pretty regular meditator, so you know how to do that yourself. Just find a space that feels good for you. I'd like you to bring your attention inwards. Just allow yourself to ground, whether you like to do that through your breath or through your body. I'd like you to bring yourself back through your lifetime and notice the contexts that you grew up in. How did you become the person that you are? Who influenced you? Which environments impacted you? How did you adapt to those environments? What cultural constructions were implanted in your consciousness? Which of those have you let go of or transcended? Which of them are you aware that you're still holding? And which of them do you not know that you don't know about? I'd like to orient your attention to other parts of the planet. What would it have been like to grow up in Africa? What kind of an environment do you imagine that being like? How would that have influenced the way you look at the world? How about China? What if you'd grown up in that society? How might you perceive power structures, culture, history? Spiritual lineages? Now let's imagine that you were another species entirely. What would it be like to grow up as an ant on planet Earth? To be in a connected community, collective of ants. Let's expand out wider to being the entire cosmos itself. If you were the whole cosmos, from matter to life to mind, how would you perceive this meta-crisis on planet Earth? And now I'd like you to come back into that room that we're in and allow yourself to keep those perspectives in mind, in the back of your mind, as we go through the presentation today, and see how that might influence the perspectives you choose to take about some of the topics that I'll share here today. So I'll start a little bit with how I developed my perspectives. And I'm sure there are bits and pieces of egos that'll come out here as I'm sharing. And the intent is hopefully to share perspectives that will be useful in understanding how I came to the perspectives that I seem to hold. So I started as an I, like we all do, as a child that wasn't even aware of that I. And it took being part of a family for me to begin to realize. Terry was talking about moving from 1.0 to 1.5. Still not really aware that there are other I's out there, but certainly being impacted by them. They were getting in my way when I was trying to get things. And then we move to 2.0. We expand out. We have the wider family, our extended family. We start to realize, ooh, there are rules here. Can't just do whatever I want whenever I want it. Now, I was born in Ireland and lived there until I was 7. And I was 7, moving into that 2.0 arena, I moved out to Africa. And it felt like a completely different world. And in some ways, it was. The basics that we take for granted in the developed world, schooling, healthcare, just the basics of even having shelter and food, were not guaranteed for a great many of the people. And it shifted my perspective entirely of what was important. What should I do? What should I care about? I was blessed to be born into a family where my mom was incredibly generous, and so she would take children into our house and foster them, orphans, until they could be found a family. And it just hit me really hard to be in a society where there were so many orphans, and with the basics to healthcare, their mothers could have survived. Many of them had contracted HIV/AIDS, and because they didn't have the proper healthcare, it can be easy with the proper practices not to pass that on to the child, but without proper healthcare, the child automatically contracts it at birth. And so it was just so saddening for me to see, coming from a developed part of the planet, what it was like for these people to grow up in these places of no fault of their own, just born into that world. And I kind of held that, and I held a bit of guilt around it, given that my father was a diplomat, so we had a lot of support around us. And I noticed kind of a growing sense of irritation and unease with the privilege that I'd been given. Why? Why did I get it? And why could I have this support around me? Even just having two parents, or to be able to go to school, when so many didn't have that. And it confused me as a child. I didn't fully understand why? Why me? And to this day, I guess to a certain extent, I still don't fully have an answer to that question. But it still impacts me deeply. And so I went out into the world and tried to figure out, different ways of looking at this problem. And thankfully, my dad brought me out to Asia, to China, when I was just 12 years old. And it just transformed my perspective about what was possible. Because in my head, I thought of China, kung fu movies and all that, the straw hats and the pointy roofs, and it wasn't that. It was, I arrived in Shanghai, and it felt like arriving in a sci-fi movie. Skyscrapers as far as the eye could see, roads on top of roads on top of roads on top of roads, 15 floors up in the sky going around the buildings. I was like, what is this place? And it made me think, well, if this is a developing country, and they can do this, what's happening that's different here? And so I started to research and try to understand different societies and how they worked. And so developed a little bit more complexity. And, that complexity turned into too much complexity. And if this looks confusing, imagine what it's like in here. But yeah, so I found all these different thought leaders, beautiful people. A large amount of these are actually in the room right now. Might not be able to see at the back, but we have many of my friends here in the room today that have influenced me and my perspectives. And it's through these relationships that I've learned, relationships with people living and dead, that I've learned to take some different perspectives and to look at different challenges in different ways. And I find myself continually landing in new perspectives and holding on to those and thinking that I've figured it out, and then for that to be blown away and realizing it's still small, not quite capturing a bigger essence or a bigger picture. So I'll go through how some of these people have influenced me a little bit later on, but I wanted to start first with China. Because China is a different world. They have a different internet, where all of the apps that you know don't exist. There's no Facebook, no YouTube, no Twitter, no Google, no Amazon, none of those. It's an entire different internet, but it's an entire different culture, entire different perspective on the world. Ray Dalio, who's one of the world's foremost investors, has done some fascinating research about the rise and fall of civilizations. He's looked over the past 500 years to understand how we, as a collective, as a global civilization, have moved through power dynamics. And this is his research. I find it interesting. And some of the things that he's identified is that, in fact, over the last 500 years, the civilization that has had the most power for the most time has been China. It's just that about 200 years ago, they had a big dip into the century of humiliation. And I won't go too deep into history here, but I just want to share a collective question that we might have around who decides what we do on planet Earth? Who makes the decisions? Within our lifetimes, it's been a pretty clear answer. And I'm not from this part of the planet, but many people here are. And there has been a certain way of thinking about the way the world works that has been shared around the world in a variety of different ways. Some of those healthy, some of those damaging. And so in his research, Ray Dalio looks at a number of different factors and notices that there are trajectories of certain things that come before others. Like, for example, trade often tends to come first. And China is now the largest trading partner with most countries in the world. We have military, which they are expanding. We have output. We have technology, education. And we're seeing with the technologies, recently we've had these crises with Huawei and the 5G networks. We've seen TikTok come into the consciousness of the young around the world, fastest growing app in the world. Things that people said the Chinese would never be able to do. And yet they found ways of innovating. And in some ways, if these indications are correct, this might only be the beginning. So why does that matter? I want to take a moment to kind of deconstruct the Chinese perspective a little bit. And I know that's a bit of a generalization, and generalizations are always wrong, but sometimes useful. And so if we take the integral framework, we have the individual and the collective and the internal and the external. One of the things that is prized in this part of the planet is the individual freedoms above anything else. And in the East, it's not exactly like that. It's a little bit different. The collective is favored in most contexts over the individual. And for me, growing up in Europe, and then in Africa, and then in China, it was confusing to try and find my place in all of that. What do I prioritize? When my wife is Chinese, and we have children who are mixed, how do we decide as a family what to do going forwards? And how do we decide as a collective human family to decide what to do next when we have such different values and ways of looking at the world? I've also noticed that the external tends to be prioritized over the internal in China. I would say that's probably true of pretty much every country I've been to, except for one that I haven't been to yet, Bhutan, which talks about gross domestic happiness instead of gross domestic product, right? So we tend to have a favoring the external, and in the Chinese, they favor the collective. So I wanted to start with a bit of a story to share some of my own personal experiences that have impacted me deeply, so you get an idea before I go into some of the stats and details of this. The first one being, when my son was born, about 9 years ago, it was a very difficult experience. We were in China at the time, and my wife decided to have the birth at a Chinese public hospital, which, wanting to support her decision, I was totally fine with. And when the birth happened, our son, Griffin, had a breathing problem, and he was taken away from us. My wife didn't even get to see him. He was taken straight, taken to another room. Now, in most places around the world, I'd be like, okay, let's go and see him now. Like once she's okay and she's kind of settled down a little bit. But in this situation, they said, no, you can't see him. We're going to take care of him until he's okay, and then you can have him back. They were taking the responsibility for the collective to make sure they had the collective in mind, as opposed to the individual, which we wanted to see our child. And me studying psychology and all this, knowing the potential trauma of having a child without their mother for the first few days. We went back, day after day. There wasn't even a window that we could look through. Day after day, we went back. Can we take our son home? No. Why not? He's not well yet. When can we take him home? When he's well. When will that be? We don't know. Day after day after day. 10 days later, we arrived. Can we take him home? Yeah, he's fine now. We took him home. But it impacted me so deeply, I had to leave my job and set up a business at home so I could take care of him. And just be with him, wanting to support him through the first year of his life. And I remember being with him every day, and he had an aversion to my touch. He wouldn't like me to touch him. But I remember one day staying at home from work and just deciding to be present with him for that day. And I was just sitting there with him, and as I do, because I'm a touchy-feely person, I put my hand on his back. And realizing that he usually doesn't like me to touch him, I took it away. And for the first time in his life, he turned around, grabbed my hand, and put it back on his back. And it healed something inside me that allowed me to feel like, okay, he's all right. I've been able to support him, and we have this connection now. And so that's a personal experience. I've also been in China over the last few months when we had the lockdowns during COVID. I don't know if you heard what it was like in Shanghai. I don't know if all the stories were true, but certainly some of them were. And we were at home in our apartment and locked in, literally, on the 7th floor with 2 children and a dog. Like, not even able to go downstairs to take the dog for a walk for months. 3 months in a row. Not easy, right? So I've had my fair share of, difficulties, challenges living within that ecosystem. But I wanted to lighten it up a little bit now and share a bit more about, well, those are some of the things that on an individual level are really challenging. And there are people who are going through unimaginable suffering in China every day, right now, for a number of different reasons. My children went through the Chinese public school system for a few years, and regularly were up until midnight, 1 a.m. doing homework. Not right, not good, but that's part of how the system works there. And I started with that because I wanted to get a little bit into the collective psyche of what I imagine a lot of people outside of China might think about China. Right? Like this kind of some of my stories might have validated some of your perspectives on the way that China is and the way you think that it operates. And I want to share perhaps a slightly different perspective. And I'll bring you through a few different pieces that I hope will shift your perspective a little bit. The first one being, if we look at China from a developmental perspective, I'm just going to read this quote. It's from a good friend of mine named Peggy Liu, who some of you in this room also know. And I'll share a bit more about her later, but I just want to read the quote. So, no person is perfect. No country is perfect. It may not be where you want it to be now, but China is heading in the right direction. China is not the China of 30 years ago. The country is changing so fast, it's a new country every 5 years. Please be patient and remember how long it took the West to develop. It's developing basic legal capacities from scratch. Rule of law classes were started in 2017 at government academies. It was a baby learning to crawl. Now it's a lanky teen whose parents don't quite understand it. But it's quickly coming into its own by observing and interacting with the outside world and deciding what aligns with its own context and values. Loving constructive input rather than nagging put-downs is what this teen needs most. China is changing at giga scale and giga pace. Engaging with Chinese citizens at a cultural exchange level is the best way to change China and bring it towards Western sensibilities. Only with collaboration has China been able to learn and leapfrog. The Chinese emphasis on saving face means it really doesn't help to change things in China by critiquing it in public or doing protests on the streets. The world will win if companies can figure out a collaborative way of working with Chinese companies rather than build a digital wall. So I often hear from people when I start talking about China, there's a few key topics that come up, and I don't have time to go into each of them today, from Hong Kong to Taiwan to Tibet to Xinjiang. I could do a specific presentation on each of those that could go for hours. But I wanted to share that the main idea that often comes across to me is that it's like, no, well, like, we love the Chinese people because they're people, but it's the government. It's the government that we don't like, right? Something wrong there. And I've never seen a perfect government, and there's sure things that could be changed about the Chinese government. But I also want to see if we can have a slightly different understanding from a Chinese perspective of how they look at their government. So in an independent study done on Chinese political opinions by the Harvard Kennedy School of Governance, right? So this is properly independent. This is not a Chinese study, right? They found, in the longest study that's ever been done, near universal increase in Chinese citizens' average satisfaction towards all 4 levels of government. 95.5% of respondents were relatively satisfied or highly satisfied with their government. In comparison, in the US, 38% of people are satisfied with their federal government. And who's teaching who how to have a better government? Or who thinks that they have the higher ground? Interesting. By 2016, the Chinese government was more popular than at any point during the previous 2 decades. Now, we could throw this all out the window and chalk it up to brainwashing, right? That is a perspective we could take. And I'm not saying it's not correct. Mighty difficult to brainwash 1.3 billion people. But regardless, let's have a look at why. Why? If the Western media and the developed world looks at China through such a critical lens, why do the Chinese people see their government in this way? So let's start with a few different ways of looking at the way the society works. So I would say, from my perspective, the most valuable thing the Chinese government has done over the last 30 years is to essentially eradicate poverty in a developing country. In the last 3 to 4 decades, they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. 800 million. There isn't even 800 million people in the entire developed world. They've lifted those people out of poverty. Now, that's the concrete needs, some of the concrete needs met. Now, lifting them out of poverty doesn't mean that, society is great and all that, and they're getting all their needs met, but there's a bare minimum there that they've met. And I can honestly say, having lived in Africa, having lived in different places around the world, that you actually have traveled all around China. You don't see the kind of destitute poverty that you see in other places. I even see destitute poverty in the developed world that I don't see in China. Now, it may be that there's many farmers that do a hard living and it's difficult for them, but it's not the same kind of destitute poverty that I see in other places. It's quite interesting. So how have they achieved this? So one of the things that China is known for is being fast and doing things quickly. And we can see here in this graph that China's actually developed about 4 times faster than the US in terms of economic development. So what took the US from 1900 to 2017 to do in terms of rapid growth, China did in 30 years. 30 years versus over 100. That economic development has helped create a stability. Now, I think in the developed world, we look at that and we might also be a bit critical. That's GDP, and is GDP really the best measure? And, economic development, is that really most important? But let's think for a second about the developmental level of the society that we're talking about. Have the fundamental needs, the fundamental concrete needs been met? And if not, then what's the priority? What should we actually be focusing on? Now, we might say that, well, yeah, they could do this whole economic development thing with a different form of government, and they could still be maybe democratic or whatever it is that we'd like to throw over there for them to use. But let's take a control example of India. Back in 1980, the GDP in China and India was comparable per capita. And now, China has 5x per capita GDP than India. Something different going on there. And why? So we think, oh, democracy is a great idea, we got to build it out in this way, and everyone should do what we do. But let's pause for a second. We've tried that tactic before. We did it with religions. We did it with colonialism. Do we really have the answer? And if we actually think about the question of what actually supports development, it's a contextual question because the question is development of who? In what context? With China, what are the fundamental needs that are to be met with the whole developed world? In the whole world, we have 15% of the global population in developed countries, 85% in developing countries. The vast majority of the consciousness of humanity is living in developing countries. How do we support that? How do we ask that question very seriously, rather than only focusing on a select few? So I've had a question about this. Like, democracy is like, just, it feels good and sounds like a good idea, but does it actually work to support countries to lift themselves out of poverty or to develop health in healthy ways? I've talked to Richard Barrett about this, who some of you may know, who's done a consciousness index of planet Earth. I've talked to Thomas Bjorkman, who wrote the book on the Nordic societies and how they're different. And I've learned from some other scholars who've studied China and other Asian countries. And it turns out that democracy doesn't precede development. Democracy comes after development. Once you have a population that is psychologically developed to a certain point, democracy emerges naturally. But if you try to force it earlier than the society is ready, you can stunt its growth. So it just makes us think about, the interventions that we're using and sharing and recommending for around the world, are they actually in the benefit of the population? So I want to share a bit of an interesting idea with you, and that is, well, maybe China is actually doing something that's actually really valuable, not just for China, but for the whole of planet Earth. Did you know that the Earth is actually greener now than, well, I don't know about now, but at least back in 2017 when this was done, greener in 2017 than it was 25 years before that? Or we hear about, all the desertification that's happening, and all, which are all very real. But turns out that the Earth is actually getting greener, at least it was in that period of time. The vast majority of that, over 50% of that, was thanks to China. What were they doing to make the world a greener place? Turns out they were turning deserts into greenlands. There's a fascinating researcher by the name of John Delio who's done documentaries about this and looked at how the Chinese populations have actually done this, how they've transformed some of the biggest deserts in the country to grasslands, greenlands, forests. And it's this emphasis on the collective rather than the individual and the power structures that exist there that have somehow allowed for something like this to happen. This is where I want to bring Peggy Liu back into the picture. So Peggy, fascinating character. So she's Chinese-American. Gino knows her well. She's Chinese-American, a real firecracker. I think she'll allow me to project that on her. She has done something that I didn't know if it was possible. And she doesn't seem to take a lot of credit for it, but it's one of the most incredible feats that a human has done in our generation, from my perspective. She started off with this idea that, the US and China have never actually talked about this problem of climate change that we're facing. The two biggest economies in the world have never had an official conversation about this. So she said, that should change. She set up a conference, let some of the top officials talk, and they were all like, wow, like, why have we not done this before? Duh, right? Afterwards, they're like, you've got to do something about this. You've got to, like, change what's happening here. So she set up the joint US-China collaboration on clean energy. And essentially what she did was she helped bring different people into the space to have conversations about what do we do about this? If China keeps developing at the rate that it's developing, knowing that it wants to get to developed country status, if it actually does get to developed country status, look at climate change. We're in trouble. So we've got to do something. We've got to create an ecological civilization. We've got to change the way that this society runs before we get there, not after. This is a difficult problem. It's a complex problem. How do we do that? So she gathered groups together to think about this and to talk about this. And she came up with the concept of what she called the China Dream, which is like the American dream, but instead of the individual rags to riches, it's the collective flourishing of a society. How do we do that? So this China Dream concept she started talking about, and she was talking to a journalist for the New York Times at one point, and challenging some of his perspectives on China and how China needs to develop. And he wrote an article about it in the New York Times. This was back in the days when New York Times was still allowed in China to publish material. And a bunch of people caught wind of it. And she got published in a bunch of different magazines in China as like the green goddess, this idea of how do we create a green China, a green ecological civilization. Well, it turns out, not long after, Xi Jinping came into power. And his main thrust, his main vision was what he called the China Dream. Since 2008 until now, China has gone from nowhere to overtaking everywhere else in virtually every renewable energy, from wind to hydro to solar. I'm going to keep going because it's pretty ridiculous how far they've gone. We can go into hydropower capacity up there in the top right, China's main chunk. We can look at nuclear. We can look at photovoltaic, solar installations. And you can see here the red line that goes all the way up is China just in the last few years. And a lot of this, I don't know if she'll take the credit, but a lot of this came down to Peggy Liu going into government and training over 1,000 government officials on how do we actually create an ecological civilization that is sustainable. So what happened was, within a few years, China overtook the US in renewables, overtook the EU in renewables, and now it's thinking about how do we actually implement these renewable energies? How do we create a whole civilization that runs on electric? Electric mobility, China's far and ahead away from everyone else. If we look at e-buses alone, China has virtually all of the world's e-buses. I think it's over 99%. And that will still be true in 2040. They will still have the vast majority of e-buses in the world. They are pumping hard, and they are shifting the civilization, and it is transforming quick. I'll give you one image that'll give you a picture of this. Back in 2008, when Peggy started her idea, there was no high-speed railway in China, virtually none. 2020, it's actually different now, it's 2022, they build quick. The transformation, these can all be run electrically. Now, we could say, oh yeah, but the still main source of power is still coal. Yes, but this is where it comes to the next part of the genius. Peggy says, the core to this is the smart grid, that we can make the shift immediately from coal to electricity when we have the renewables up and running. So she helped them develop this concept of the smart grid across China, and now China has more smart cities than the rest of the world combined, and accelerating ahead. But the thing is that we're looking at all the external pieces here. What about the internal development of the Chinese people? A little bit more difficult to get data on, so excuse the difference, but it does still turn out that they are focusing very heavily on education. And in fact, if you look at some of the research, the Chinese are willing to invest in education far and above higher and more, both on an individual level and on a collective level than anyone else. The STEM graduates that are coming out of China, the collective brain that is happening, that is being created, the world has never seen a force like what is being developed in China right now. And we could look at that with fear. We could also look at it with opportunity and promise. And we're all humans. So what is it like for us to develop together? And how do we come into alignment so that we're aligned going forwards? Now, there's other things that they're doing where they're expanding out to the rest of the world. This is looking at the Belt and Road Initiative. They're kind of helping create new ways of trade and development and all of this, which I could go on and on about the different things that are being done. But it's really just astonished me, some of the things that they've managed to do. And it's asked me the question, how do we create structures that are applicable for the context and the developmental structure that we're aiming for? And so I've shared this to kind of help share that I'm coming from a slightly different perspective when it comes to global society and how we might do things and what might actually be supportive. And I want to get into the Universifying model, but I wanted to share this first. And actually, I don't know if Layman's in the room somewhere, but if you weren't interested in the China stuff, you can just blame him, because he told me to add it in here to give a bit of a China perspective, because there aren't that many kind of integral thinkers that have a lot of time over there. And I thought that that would be useful to add. But I think it also informs what comes next. Now, instead of waiting till the end, I want to just check in here at this point if there are any questions that you might like me to share my perspective on before we move into the model and how it was developed and how I think it might be practically useful for helping us move in a direction that we would like to go. So, any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So, Maslow's lowest need is survival.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like they're doing really good on survival. That's pretty far from self-actualization. How are they doing on that?
It really depends on what you're looking at and how you perceive it. I would say that the Chinese civilization has a lot of psychotechnologies built into it that have not yet been leveraged. Right? We have Taoism, we have Buddhism, we have Confucius, we have a number of different intellectual scholars up along the centuries, millennia, that have come up with different psychotechnologies to help support the development of the population. I would say that at this point, I imagine the priority, like it is with a child who's growing up, is to feed the child, make sure that it's adequately nurtured. And as the child grows and becomes a teenager, you help it socialize with the rest of the world and help develop good relationships. And as it goes out into the world and starts to achieve and create good things, and you help it move towards self-actualization. And so I would ask the question, when are we ready to help China with its self-actualization? Or when is China ready to move into its own process of self-actualization? I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I think it helps orient my attention towards choosing the priority of the moment. Thanks for the question.
Can you come for the mic, please?
Oh, to the mic? All right.
Hi, Fionn.
Hey.
What are the odds, do you think, that China rediscovers its Taoist, Confucian, Buddhist roots, which for me was one of the most awesome flowerings of the human mind, and integrates them into this modern smart equation that you're spelling out, and everything is wonderful in that context?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Joe. So in some ways, I would say it's already been integrated. The question is, integrate how much, at what level, in what context? I don't want to get too much into Chinese politics and political structure and all that, but suffice to say, I did not understand the Chinese government at all before I started actually studying it from a Chinese perspective. And I mean, it also helps to be able to read and write in Chinese to be able to do that, because things are different when they've been translated and all of that. Now, Confucianism, I mean, this is my perspective, so different people have different idea. Confucianism, I would say, is already very strongly a part of the way that the society is run. It's core to the ways, and they'll be explicit about that too. In terms of Buddhism, Buddhism is a religion. At least that's the way it's seen, and so religion and politics are kept separate. Taoism's a bit different. It's both a philosophy and a religion. They also want to be careful, though, so they often don't explicitly talk about it being a part of the way that it's run, but you can see if you look at the leading edge thinkers that a lot of the ideas do actually come through from Taoist orientations. One thing that I will add, which will likely be a bit controversial, and don't know if people would like to hear it, is from what I can see, the most complex developed leader on planet Earth right now is probably Xi Jinping. And if you look at his language and the way that he speaks and the way that he thinks, that's not always a good thing, though, right? Because we also know there were some other people in histories who had late-stage capacities who created a lot of damage in society. So capacity means they have power to change things, to move things, to shift things. That's not always a good outcome. So it's something for us to be aware of. Thanks, Joe. Last question, then I'll keep going.
I have a question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little. I'm from Sri Lanka, and I think some of you who may have followed the news know that Sri Lanka is in a complete economic collapse. And I first blame Sri Lanka for certain really egocentric, power-hungry leaders that put themselves into that situation. However, China is playing a huge role in a certain kind of a colonization of poor, vulnerable economies and vulnerable countries. So that's a very kind of a cunning system that China has built in pouring money into vulnerable economies. And then, like, Sri Lanka has borrowed so much money from China that now it has to borrow money to pay interest back to China on the loans that they have poured into Sri Lanka. Here, we'll give you more, we'll give you more, we'll give you more, for kind of nonsensical cosmetic projects in Sri Lanka. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to what's gonna follow in Bangladesh, in Kenya, in Nepal, lots of other countries where China is doing a kind of a new colonization.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And the first thing that hits me is just the suffering of the people in Sri Lanka and in other places who are dealing with these kinds of challenges. There's tragedy, and it saddens me to hear those kinds of stories. I've also done my research in what's so-called the debt trap narrative, that China creates these debt traps by lending money and then taking resources. And if you actually go and check out some of the research, it turns out that that's a false narrative. That's not actually structurally what happens, although it does sell newspapers, and it's easy to get that perspective across when someone already has a critical view of China. So I won't go into the complexity of specifically Sri Lanka, and also I'm not an expert in the field, but I will say that there is probably more than meets the eye on first impression, and it's useful to go a little bit deeper into the research and find out what's going on and see how we collectively can create structures to help support healthy, flourishing development. And clearly, there's things that China could do differently. And we also need to be aware of the stage of development that it's at and the kinds of decisions that we make when we have certain developmental perspectives. So moving on here, I wanted to move into, the model. And I'll go a little bit, faster through this because I think a lot of it has been covered by Terry in her talk. Because a lot of my work has been built upon Terry and Kim, who've been very close friends and mentors of mine over the last few years and have very much informed how this has come through me and how I hold space for it. So I want you to start with some universal polarities, 1 and 0, time, timeless, the yin, the yang, dark and light, as things that are among all cultures, exist in every single culture. We see them in every language as things that we, as human beings, seem to be able to perceive in a variety of different ways. And the question is, this reality, this universe that is unfolding before us, that we are a part of, that we are, how does it actually come into form? It's kind of going back to basic principles. How do I make sense of any of this? Let's see if I can go back to the basic principles. If there are some form of polarities that come into existence, how is it that they interact? How is it that they come into form? And it was actually Terry's stages model that's been informed by many of the people in this room that helped me get a bit of a better understanding of how this might work. So, you have the concrete world, which I call the hard fields, the subtle world, the soft fields, and what Terry calls the metaware, which I call the meta fields. Different aspects of reality that we interact with, become aware of in a variety of different ways. And I, too, was confused by the whole inside-outside thing and the zones. And so I wanted to try and find a way to begin to integrate it into a single model that helped me to make sense of how it actually works. And so I've found that over here, we have things that are like internalizing, and over there, we have things that are externalizing. So if we look at 1.0 as an example, I absorb, my food, I absorb all the sounds around me. 1.5, I go out and I start doing things. I start being active, right? We come back again, 2.0, like it's the reciprocal, I'm connecting with the collective, right? the integral matrix. And then I go out in the world and I'm part of, an integrated society. Now, I don't know if this is useful, but I found it useful. And I found it useful because I found another researcher, who also some of you may know, called Springcheng, who is a Chinese Taoist philosopher, whose model actually matches up almost perfectly with the stages model, coming from the I Ching. And it's fascinated me to see that she's identified 4 different categories. These are my words, not hers. She talks about allowing, the receptive, right? Becoming, going out, right? Being, in reciprocality, and doing in the world, integrating into your environment. And so she looks at it less in terms of individual and collective. She talks more like the individual and their environment, which is also kind of a bit of a Chinese perspective. But what I found fascinating was the yin and the yang, right? So the yin being these broken lines, and the yang being these full lines. And when you have an open line but a full environment, you take in, right? When you're full and your environment's full, you go out and you do everything. When you're open and your environment's open, you connect with it. And when your environment's open, but you're bringing things out, you're able to go out and unify things and bring them together. And I found this fascinating because she's also identified the same number of stages that Terry's identified up to the metaware. And what I imagine, in my model at least, that seems useful for me, is that the same way that Terry folds over her chart, right, which I got to help her with earlier, which I was very happy with, I imagine that we can fold this in and collapse it in. And I found some other pieces of understanding that have helped me really understand how this really works in the whole fractal of reality. We look at something starts as an individual, and it starts to diversify itself. It goes into, whether that's an atom or a cell or a human, whatever it might be at every level of reality, comes into a collective of multiple of those holons, and finds a way to unify into a greater whole. So we have these kind of 4 steps, and then we can kind of just keep going round and round, unifying, diversifying, unifying, diversifying, and universifying. So it becomes a singular. That's kind of the basic concept behind what I'm trying to share, holding this concept of how reality unfolds itself as a singular concept. Because we know that unification happens, we know that diversification happens, and we know that it's the pulse of these that emanates out into all of conscious development. I've found geometry to be a really useful way of helping conceptualize and understand and embody this. And so I built that into my model as well. The other piece here that I want to share is about field theory. So in the integral frame, we talk about states and we talk about stages. And I think that's a useful distinction. I also think that maybe not enough work has been done about how those interpenetrate. And I know Terry is really leaning deeply into that topic. And for me, the field perspective really helps to make sense of that. Because if we look at how fields in different contexts operate, if we think of states as a field that we're tapping into, the stage is just being able to sit stably in that field. So we can access any field that's around us anytime, whether that's through psychedelics or meditations or whatever it might be. But do we actually know how to bring that state with us into multiple contexts? And if we know how to do that, we've solidified into that stage, and we can hold that perspective regardless of which context we're moving into. And of course, I had to bring good old Ken Wilber back in at some point. So I think it's still useful to have, with the whole Chinese flowing, circular, everything moving, we can make distinctions. Some of those distinctions are useful. So one thing that I do a little bit different, and I know it's a bit of just a linguistic thing, is instead of just the individual as a domain, we can also look at it as individualizing, becoming an individual. It's like the more we move in that direction, the more we become an individual, and collectivizing, how we become more of a collective. And this is kind of more the Chinese orientation of less creating specific domains and more of a how do we flow between domains. Same thing with the internalizing and the externalizing, that we're moving back and forth at all times. And so one of the things that I learned from Spring Chung that I found a really useful way of understanding her model was that in the developmental perspective, at least in the West, it's often seen as, we try not to do that stair-step thing, don't we? It's like, yeah, and we have to explain that, no stage is better than any other stage, and, and we have to keep emphasizing that because, when 3.5 achievers get a hand of this model, they really try to drive to the top. But at the same time, we can see these as fields of existence. We have the concrete fields, the hard fields, our bodies, the environment that we're in, right? My body doesn't go away when I develop into the subtle. And I can still be receptive or absorbing with my body, or I can be active, right? So in every moment, my body is either absorbing or it's active. So I want to do a quick exercise. Start everyone now just noticing what it's like for you to be sitting here in a chair. You're just receptive, listening to my words and absorbing the air into your body. I want everyone to stand up for a second. I want you to just shake your arms around a little bit and just notice what that feels like. You shake your arms around a little bit. Now, I'm going to stop talking for a little while, and I want you to stop listening, and I want you to start thinking. So keep shaking your arms and start thinking. Now what I'd like you to do is turn to the person next to you and grab their hands, grab them by the hands. And if there's groups of 3, that's fine too. I want you to grab them by the hands. Yeah. And yeah, do the whole we're reciprocating. One person take the lead, the other person take the lead. Let's play around, let's have fun. And I want you to talk a little bit at the same time, listen a little bit at the same time, just interact, have fun. Yeah. Now, I'd like everyone to hug. A big hug. Big hug. For as long as that's comfortable. All right, and everyone take a seat again. So, within that short period of time, we've played with the concrete and the subtle. The metaware is a little bit more ethereal to get a hold of, but the concrete, we're receptive, absorbing, just kind of allowing. And then we moved into, moving around, being active, right? So it's not that those developmental levels go away, right? We always have our body, it's always here, right? Our thoughts are still there, And we can be receptive, we can be listening, or we can be active, right? So we can be internalizing, we can be externalizing, right? We can be doing that by ourselves, or we can be doing that in a collective. And so the hug was kind of like the interpenetration at the end, right? The unification. We are one. So that's kind of helped me see that we have our bodies, and our bodies are always in one of these 4 states. We have our minds, the subtle realm, the soft fields, and those are always in one of these 4 states. We have conscious awareness, or the meta-aware, the witnessing, or however it is that we would like to frame that. Spring calls it light. I kind of like that. Right? She has the dense field, the middle plane, and light. Right? The light field is always there. It never goes away. Just that we may not be able to fully articulate it at certain developmental levels. We may not fully know that it's very much a part of our reality. But as we develop, we find it, and we lean into it, and we become it. So another model that I'm just recently beginning to integrate and find meaning with is John Kessler's work with the integral polarity practice. And one of the things that you might find if you hear me do a presentation like this in a month or two, it might be a totally different model because it keeps evolving. But it reminds me of the polarities and the movement between the polarities and the still point that exists in the middle, and how the collapse of the whole comes into unity at one point, and that unity can be held. And that we can move through the absorbing into the diversifying, into the connecting, and back into unifying, back into absorbing again. And we can just do that forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and into infinity. So that's kind of more or less how the model comes together into all these different forms. So we have the diversity of all these different models and the integration, the unity of them all. And still playing with it, and I find it fun and useful, and I hope that you might feel the same. The next question is the pre-people piece that Terry brought up. So this is the people realm and how people consciousness seems to work. How does the pre-people and perhaps the post-people work? So we've developed in a universe that has matter that absorbs and imbues and becomes life and then mind and then something else. We have the elements to turn into organisms and sentience and into something else. We have the solar system that develops into planetary systems that develop the organisms and the life that, has the whole galactic proportion into something else. And we have the physiosphere that develops the biosphere, develops the noosphere, and something else. Another 4-tier distinction. Don't know if it is relevant or makes any sense or has any validity, but it's a fun kind of mental play around. I didn't say the word masturbation. So, the meta crisis. What are we going to do about it? How do we deal with it? We're dealing with all these challenges on planet Earth right now. We can frame them a bunch of different ways. I'm not too attached to how they're framed, but it tends to be useful to look at it from a more wide perspective. We have an emerging world. What is this that we can birth? We have potential mental harmony, physical functionality, social harmony, systemic functionality. There's a lot of different things that we can do. We wake up, we grow up. I've switched around the cleanup piece a little bit. I've never had a dirty shadow. Don't know about any of you. I like to light up my shadows. Another thing that I've learned recently from Ken Wilber, he talked about opening up. Right? He talks about the multiple intelligences and the different lines, and there are different perspectives around whether or not those are actually valid beyond a certain perspective. And I think that we can integrate those into, yes, we need to open up into different kind of capacities and diversify, and then we come into unity, and then the shadow work is when it actually really comes useful later on anyway. So having those, the education and the healing as held as one in a collective. And then showing up, of course, which unifies and integrates the whole. We're facing a lot of challenges right now. I don't really feel like reading those out. So I'll skip past it. But there are lots of opportunities. What can we do about them? There are lots of different things that we can do, and these are just a few that I've listed out. So I want to share them because how do we actually apply models like this in the real world? And I think that's one of the things that's been notoriously difficult about the integral model. I really appreciate the people who have both attempted and succeeded in applying it in a variety of different distinctions. So one of the things that I do is I work with a man named Faisal Alibai, there at the back. Hands up, Faisal. Oh, thank you. Faisal's amazing. And we together have created something that I feel has huge potential to support in a variety of different domains. So if we start with the domain perspective, like the internal and the external and the individual and the collective, we can see supporting the individual on the mental, emotional, and the relational side. We can see on the external, kind of, getting into their genomics and epigenetics. Say hi to Dan and Mikra. They're in the back. Genomics, epigenetics, we do it with them. Getting the whole kind of full biometric scale, understanding how someone's doing physically. Or we can do both, right? We can have the whole kind of full spectrum of assessments and understanding how someone's doing in all different domains. And we can also look at the relational dynamics between people, right? The family as a whole, right? How do we actually check to see what are the dynamics between people and how do we support them to create harmony within the family? Next piece, which is still in development, is around how do we look at society as a whole? How do we support the mass? How do we really bring these principles and support in all these domains to a wider audience? And we're looking at different partners and from tech platforms and all sorts of things to do that. So that's the domain specific. If we look at the kind of more process specific, how can we actually do this? So we have the assessments, kind of the absorbing, we figure out all the information, move into diversification. We usually start with the body and the mind, because the relational stuff needs to come a bit later, collective domain. Move into the transformation, and then finally we have the integration at the end. So kind of moving people through programs. A number of the people and beautiful practitioners in this room are part of these pathways that we develop for people. And I'm always love to hear about more practitioners that have different gifts that we can give to people. So please come to me afterwards if you're someone that you feel could bring value to this field. We have a lot of different challenges that we're dealing with in the hard domains, the soft domains, and the meta domains. The meta ones are slightly less easy to see. And there's a lot of potential solutions that we could use. These are just some that I've been working on over the last few years. The reality is, it's a much more complex field than that. And there's many people in this room that are working on amazing projects that I think we can bring together and unify, but hold the sacred diversification of each. So that's my call for the room today, is how do we come together? How do we move out of our silos? How do we come into connection? And how do we unify under a greater umbrella of whatever words we want to call it? Integral has been very important and impactful to me in my life. How do we find ways to come together and to build together? Because if we do, it feels to me like we could really birth something beautiful through this meta crisis. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions? 5 minutes? Yeah? Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
When or where can we buy a high gloss coffee table version of this slide deck? I will pay $20, maybe $25.
I'll go for it. So I will send it through to Lynn, and everyone can get a copy. I'm happy to share this. This is for the collective good. Change it, adapt it, make it your own. Thank you.
I want to go back to your Chinese model. We know that the most efficient form of government is a benevolent dictatorship. And the Chinese government has been very benevolent in the sense of bringing all those people out of abject poverty. But the concepts of individual rights or integral theory, multi-perspectival, seems to be clashing with that idea, and maybe the beginning of another maxim: power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We see the surveillance society that has been developed in China, and thought control, the subjugation of the Uyghurs, and there's only one way to think. So how do you see that projecting into the future, this totalitarianism and the perspectives of integral and human rights and all the rest?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm making it all up here, so I'll play with some of those ideas. I think one of the challenges with China that I've found personally is putting it into boxes of dictatorship or totalitarianism or authoritarianism or communism, and while all of those have some truth to them, it tends to oversimplify and not fully give a full picture of what's going on. Where it's going into the future, one of the things that I've noticed viscerally in my system over the last few years in China is that it's started to separate from the rest of the world. If I was a teenager and the rest of the world was angry at me, I don't know how happy I'd be to go out and to have friends and go to the parties and all that. I might try and protect myself, go inside, build some defenses. Now, what that will look like going forwards, I have hopes, I have dreams. 20% of global population lives in that country, which is a fifth of our brothers and sisters. And so my hopes and dreams are that China can continue to develop in healthy ways and find ways to be able to become more moral and ethical and find ways of understanding different cultures and interact in healthy ways with the rest of the global economy. They have a vision by 2049 to become a fully developed country. And I don't know if they'll make it, but I'd be surprised if they don't. So what that would mean is that we would have a country of 1.3, maybe a bit less at that point because the birth rate is a bit low, over 1 billion people in a developed country, which we've never seen before on planet Earth. And if it was operating the way it is now, then we're in for a big problem. But it won't be. It'll evolve, and it'll develop, and we'll have new leadership come up in a variety of different ways. And I'm hopeful, although I've also recently made the decision not to live there. And so I feel like there are reasons why I would live there, like it's great for business and developing network and all that, but also it's not the best place to educate my children, and not the place to have beautiful nature around me, because there is a lot of pollution, because, hey, China makes everything for all of us. So I have a hope, I have a dream, that China can develop into the China dream and an ecological civilization, and that it can support the rest of the world to develop in its own way. Whether or not it will do that or can do that, who knows? But I hold that hope in my heart. Thank you. Brendan?
Yeah, awesome presentation. Thank you very much. And there's a lot there, you know. And one of the slide that I really like the most is toward the end. You have different, you know, the meta crisis says envisioned in the quadrants, you know, because seeing that some of the people who are at least aware of these greatest challenges of our time, and they tend to want to reduce their approach to one thing. You know, all we need is meaning, you know, and we do. All we need to do is protect the biosphere, or all we need is development. So have you thought, though, of, I was imagining maybe there's a handful of manageable fulcrum points that we can recognize that we need to work on each of these areas. And I hadn't thought, actually, of how these could align with the different quadrants. Yeah. But nonetheless, I think that there's probably more than just 4. We can imagine there's probably 4 categories, but, you know, maybe there's 10 things. Or have you thought about things in that? Like, what are the just like manageable handful of things that we can address simultaneously that are all important in their own right? Probably aligning somehow with the quadrants, but maybe just a little more granular than that.
Thank you. Thank you, Brendan. I mean, I think about that question almost every day. And, you know, I find myself keep finding different answers to that question. I like to think of it as like the acupuncture points that we can hit that will really kind of vibrate through the whole system and create ripples out. And the way that I've been holding that is what I call like a full spectrum developmental like meta ecosystem. Like, how do we have something that includes all the quadrants, that includes all the different ways of waking up, growing up, lighting up, showing up, and have ways of developing that. We're in conversations with some of the wonderful people in this room. Shout out to Turquoise. Shout out to the ILR, Integral Leadership Review team. Shout out to Stefan from WeFlow. You know, Tucker is like core to this, Tucker Walsh. So like there's a few people in the system that are really orienting towards these questions and trying to find ways to deal with it. I imagine that at some point we can develop an entirely new ecosystem that holds those acupuncture points, those nodes, and really forces, pushes, supports, diversifies new ways of energy to come into those points and allow them to flourish and develop. I see Web3 and the development of a type of digital ecosystem where an individual has their sovereignty and owns their own data and doesn't give it up to the corporation as an integral part of that so that they can exist in the ecosystem without being exploited. And with that as the basis, if we can individualize each person's digital experience into, dare I say it, the metaverse, maybe we can create structures and support systems and individualize looking at the understanding of development. And if we take models like the stages model, understand how development happens at each stage and what each person needs and what the shadows are and how we can actually integrate those into a wider model of supporting each individual in the way that they need to be supported, helping them find the resources that exist on planet Earth that'll meet their needs, doing that through an ecosystem that we all collaborate on together and build together, I have hope. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, but I have a slightly different perspective on it and an older generation's perspective on it. But you are my hope. And I have talked about the way you gave information about China and from their perspective as to what they are doing, what they have accomplished. And I have been talking about it to my generation here, and you gave me so much evidence, so I took some pictures of your slides and all that to support that claim. The other part is my hope and aspiration in young generation, your generation. And there also, you combined in this presentation the two sides. And I have to talk about my generation that still cannot get out of Chinese communism and rights and so on and so forth, which we have to shed, because your slides in the beginning showed what progress China has made in 30 years to live in this global world, and how they are adjusting their standards, their needs, etc., with the world, and then we are scared of them in many ways. And that particular modality of thinking has to change, and thank you for making all the efforts to do that. And I have to say that some of you know it, and to express my dreams, I have written a book about the future, about technology, the dance of technology and consciousness, 2084. The book is here, and I'm not selling the book here. I'm saying something about the vision that it carries is about the global world in the future. And we are going in that direction, and the work that you guys are doing, the young generation you are doing, is really indicative of the same faith and hope that I have. And by the way, if you don't know, I'm 86 years old.
Looks like no more, and all that I can do to bow down to that wisdom is